Hi, and welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today's story is different. It's not about a single act of violence. It's not about one killer or one victim. It's about a system, one that operated for years behind closed doors, disguised as care, built on silence, and fueled by profit. This is the story of a place that promised safety to the most vulnerable unwed mothers, scared and alone. A place that claimed to protect life, but instead became a quiet graveyard for children who were never supposed to be remembered. It's the story of the Ideal Maternity Home and the tragedy that came to be known as the Butterbox babies. If you're new here, my name is, and on this channel, we tell the stories that echo stories that still matter even after the headlines fade. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The House That Promised Hope. I've read about a lot of dark things in my life. Murders, disappearances, cruel manipulations. But nothing, and I mean nothing, quite prepares you for the feeling you get when you realize that a place designed to bring life into this world was actually hiding death. Imagine this, it's the 1930s. You're young, scared, alone. You've just found out you're pregnant, but you're not married. And back then, being an unwed mother wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered a full-blown scandal. Your own family might disown you. Society sees you as a shameful stain. Options. Practically none. Now imagine you hear about this place. A home for women just like you. It's called the Ideal Maternity Home. Even the name sounds like salvation. They promise discretion, safety, no judgment. A place where you can quietly have your baby and maybe even give it a better future. You don't ask many questions, you just go. Because honestly, where else would you turn? That's how it started for so many women. Dozens, eventually hundreds. And on the outside, everything looked, well, ideal. But what those women didn't know, what no one knew, was that behind the soft curtains and warm smiles, the walls of that house held secrets. The kind that make your stomach turn. It's a strange feeling when you come across a story like this. At first you think it can't possibly be real. You think someone would have stopped it, right? Someone would have said something. But no, this isn't fiction. This happened for years, and people looked the other way. When I first stumbled across the case of the Butterbox babies, I was just watching an old film one night. It was based on true events, that's what caught my attention. But as I started digging deeper, what I found chilled me. This wasn't just a story about a corrupt business. It wasn't just about adoption, or poverty, or moral judgment. This was about a carefully orchestrated system built on silence, shame, and profit, and the hundreds of lives it swallowed along the way. So today I want to take you back, not just to a time in history, but into the lives of the women who trusted that place, and the babies who never got the chance to leave it. This is the story of the Ideal Maternity Home and the tragedy that would come to be known as the Butterbox babies. Let's begin. Chapter 2. Eva's Silence. Her name was Eva Nieforth. She was just 20 when it happened, living in Nova Scotia, trying to build a quiet life for herself, trying to love someone like anyone else would at that age. But life doesn't always unfold the way we plan. And sometimes love leaves consequences that change everything. Eva had fallen for a man named Walter. They weren't married, but when Eva discovered she was pregnant, she didn't run. She didn't panic. She made a decision. A quiet, desperate decision to protect herself, her child, and maybe even Walter. Because in 1935, having a baby outside of marriage wasn't just socially difficult, it could end a woman's future. So she searched for options, for help, for hope. And that's when she found the Ideal Maternity Home. They promised no judgment, no shame, just a place to deliver her baby in peace, away from wagging tongues and disapproving stares. It sounded perfect. It sounded like what she needed. And so just before Christmas, Eva packed up and went. She arrived alone, carrying more fear than belongings, and was greeted with smiles by the owners, William and Lila Young. They welcomed her and told her she was safe, that she was doing the right thing, that everything would be taken care of. Eva trusted them, but within a week she fell seriously ill, some sort of abdominal infection. No one's really sure how she contracted it, whether it was from poor conditions, negligence, or something worse, but the infection spread quickly, and she was bedridden for weeks. By the end of January, Eva went into labor, alone, sick, weak, and terrified. The delivery was brutal. She nearly died giving birth. And her baby only lived for a few hours. No name, no certificate, just a breath, and then gone. Walter, the baby's father, hadn't known things had gotten so bad, but he received a letter from William casually written, informing him that the baby had passed and Eva was fighting for her life. No sense of urgency, no offer of real medical help, just a cold summary. Walter rushed to the maternity home. He expected grief. He expected pain. But what he didn't expect was complete indifference. When he arrived, he was told Eva hadn't received any antibiotics. The home didn't even stock them. No one had called a doctor. No one had done anything. Walter was stunned, furious. He demanded to see a doctor. He begged them to call one, but William, the owner, refused, claimed he was a doctor himself, though he wasn't a licensed physician, just a chiropractor. And at that moment, it wasn't about helping Eva anymore. It was about ego. That night, instead of medicine or comfort, Lila handed Walter a bill, $25, for the burial of the baby, not a moment of compassion, just a transaction. Walter paid. And when he tried to return to Eva's side, he was told visiting hours were over. He was forced to leave. 2 days later, Eva Neforth was dead. There was no funeral, no investigation, no public mourning, just another unwed mother, quietly erased. And that's when I knew this story wasn't just about a corrupt maternity home. It was about silence. The kind of silence that kills. The kind that wraps itself around grief and hides it under polite smiles and business as usual. Eva deserved better. Her child deserved better, and yet, she was just the beginning. Because, as I would soon find out, William and Lila Young had built their entire empire not on compassion, but on calculated cruelty. And Eva, she was just their first known victim. There would be many, many more. Chapter 3. The Youngs. A vision wrapped in virtue. I kept asking myself, how do you get to that point? How do two people look into the eyes of a dying young woman like Eva and feel nothing? Not empathy, not sorrow, not even guilt. Just the cold distance of someone checking off a to-do list. To understand that I had to look back. To before the Ideal Maternity Home even existed. Back to who William and Lila Young really were, or at least who they pretended to be. Lila was born around 1908 in a small town called Fox Point, Nova Scotia. From the outside, her early life was modest, respectable. She became a teacher, a profession that at the time was seen as virtuous, noble, even maternal. William came into her life when she was 26. He was 27, charming, educated, a graduate of a medical college in the United States. On paper, they looked like a perfect match. He spoke with confidence, dressed well, and gave the impression of someone who understood science, healing, and purpose. They married in 1925 and had 5 children of their own. It all seemed so normal. They weren't rich, not yet, but they had a dream, or what they called a vision. After a brief stay in Chicago, they moved back to Nova Scotia and purchased a small 4-bedroom cottage in East Chester. That house would later become the first version of their home for the sick. Their mission sounded genuine. They wanted to create a place where people who couldn't afford proper care could come for help, a space where medicine and morality intersected. They even had a slogan, "Where the sick get well." But here's the thing about visions. Sometimes they start with good intentions. Other times, they're just convenient lies. William, despite his doctor persona, wasn't a licensed physician. He was a chiropractor, and back then chiropractors were not seen as legitimate medical professionals. In fact, many were prosecuted just for practicing. But that didn't stop William. He called himself Dr. Young anyway, and people believed him. Lila, meanwhile, trained as a midwife. She took that role seriously, at least at first. She positioned herself as a caregiver, a helper to young mothers who had nowhere else to go. And that's when the shift began. They realized that the real opportunity, the real money wasn't in helping the sick. It was in mothers, specifically unwed mothers. Women like Iva. These women were desperate, isolated, vulnerable, and they were willing to pay almost anything to stay hidden. That's when the Youngs rebranded their little facility. It became the Ideal Maternity Home, a name that promised safety, dignity, and discretion. It was brilliant, really, in a sinister way, because no one wants to believe that the people offering sanctuary are the same ones who will eventually become your captors. They took out newspaper ads, distributed pamphlets, all of it laced with promises of confidentiality and compassion. No publicity, no judgment, just quiet support. To a scared pregnant teenager in the 1930s, it must have felt like a miracle. But what those women didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that behind the Young's soft voices and warm smiles, there was something deeply, chillingly wrong. They weren't building a home, they were building a business. And soon that business would become something far darker than anyone could have expected. Chapter 4: A Perfect Lie. The thing about darkness is it rarely shows up wearing horns. Most of the time it walks in dressed as kindness. And that's exactly what the Ideal Maternity Home did. From the outside, it looked like a godsend. A cozy cottage nestled in a quiet town, run by a well-dressed couple who spoke the language of care, faith, and morality. Their brochures showed smiling babies, flowers, scripture quotes. Their ads read like poetry, promising young women privacy, warmth, and a chance to start over without shame. No publicity, they said. Where the sick get well. A home for unfortunate girls. Everything was designed to soothe, to sound safe, respectable. And honestly, it worked. Newspapers ran flattering pieces about the Youngs. Local politicians sent letters of support. Even churchgoers donated money and supplies. Because on paper, what the Youngs were offering was rare and radical, a place that welcomed unwed mothers instead of banishing them. Back in the 1930s and 40s, getting pregnant out of wedlock could ruin your life. Families would disown you. Communities would whisper. It wasn't just judgment, it was exile. So when women found out they were expecting but had no husband, they often had nowhere to go, no safe space, no one to turn to. The Ideal Maternity Home promised to change that. It marketed itself as a refuge, a place that didn't just tolerate these women, but protected them, gave them medical care, helped them through labor, offered adoption services for their babies. No shame, no questions. And for a while, people believed it. Young women came from across Nova Scotia, some from across Canada, hoping to deliver their babies in secret and walk away with a clean slate. They arrived scared and alone, and the Youngs greeted them with open arms. But here's where things start to fracture, because beneath all those promises were contracts, fine print, rules, fees, lots of fees. You see, nothing at the Ideal Maternity Home was actually free. In fact, it was expensive. Women were charged between $100 to $500 for their stay, and this was during a time when the average weekly wage was around $8. It wasn't just the birth. They charged for diapers, for food, for baby clothes. They charged for burials. They charged for adoptions. And if a mother couldn't pay, the Youngs would go after her family, her boyfriend, anyone they could squeeze for money. And if no one could pay, well, then she paid with labor. Some women were forced to stay on and work off their debts, cleaning, cooking, doing laundry for years. I read that some stayed as long as 5 to 10 years trapped in a place they thought would be their escape. They became invisible, silenced, just another cog in a machine that fed off fear and desperation. But here's the most disturbing part. The very thing that made the Ideal Maternity Home appealing, its silence, its discretion, also made it dangerous. Women couldn't complain without outing themselves. They couldn't report abuse without risking everything. So most of them said nothing. Just like Ava, they endured, they left. Or they never left at all, and the Youngs. They just kept smiling, kept printing their pamphlets, kept talking about faith and dignity and second chances, while turning their home into a business of secrets. This wasn't just a case of greed. It was calculated exploitation. a system that thrived precisely because it looked so virtuous. And the deeper I went, the more I realized the ideal maternity home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap, and it was only going to get worse. Chapter 5: The Price of Desperation. By now, I think it's pretty clear that the ideal maternity home was never really about helping women. Not in the way they claimed. It wasn't about second chances, it wasn't about compassion, it was about money. And what horrifies me the most is just how far the Youngs were willing to go to get it. Let's start with what it cost to give birth there. Back then, as I mentioned, the average person earned maybe $8 a week. But the Youngs were charging pregnant women anywhere between $100 to $500 just to deliver their baby and stay a few days afterward to recover. That doesn't sound outrageous by today's standards, until you remember that this was the 1930s. That kind of money could take years to save, if you even had a steady job to begin with. And that was just the beginning. Once a woman entered the home, she was locked into an invisible web of charges. Need diapers? That's extra. Want bottles or formula more fees? Even funeral costs, yes. Funeral costs were tacked on if a baby didn't survive. The Youngs charged grieving mothers $20 or more just to bury their own children. And here's the thing. They made sure to collect every penny. If a mother couldn't afford to pay, they'd go straight to her family, her boyfriend, anyone they could contact. And if that still didn't work, they made her stay. Work. Scrub floors, wash linens, care for other people's babies, cook for the staff. Some women spent years like this paying off a debt they never even agreed to. They didn't come there to be prisoners, but that's exactly what they became. And because of the shame surrounding unwed pregnancy at the time, these women had no real voice. They couldn't go to the police. They couldn't even go home. The Youngs knew that. They counted on it. And they exploited it in the most calculated, cruel way possible. They even had a name for their contracts: adoption transfer agreements. If a woman gave birth and decided she couldn't keep her child, the Youngs would offer to place the baby with an adoptive family for an additional $300 fee, which again was just insane money back then. It wasn't normal. Most maternity homes didn't charge for adoption, especially not when the mother was already paying to give birth. But the Youngs turned it into a full-blown business. Sometimes women would bring their babies in after giving birth elsewhere, still desperate, still scared, and the Youngs would accept them. Not because they wanted to help, but because it was a shortcut to profit. No need for delivery services, no need to feed the mother, just take the baby and sell it. It's brutal to say it like that. But that's what it was. And what really makes me sick is how they monetized every single thing. They charged $12 for diapers, $2 for bottles, weekly babysitting fees. Everything had a price tag. And once you were in, there was no such thing as a clean exit. These weren't just clients, they were commodities. The ideal maternity home wasn't a refuge. It was a machine, one designed to drain every last cent from women who had already lost so much. Their innocence, their homes, sometimes their babies. And in many cases, their hope. And I don't think it happened by accident. The Youngs knew exactly what they were doing. They wrapped their greed in scripture. They weaponized shame. And they built a business that profited off silence because no one was supposed to talk about what happened inside those walls. But people did talk, eventually, and what came next was worse than I ever imagined. Chapter 6: The Babies They Didn't Want. There are some parts of this story I honestly didn't want to believe. When I first started researching the ideal maternity home, I thought I was looking into a financial scam, a place that overcharged, that exploited desperate women, and that alone was horrific. But then I started hearing whispers, accounts that were darker, quiet rumors that some babies never made it out of that home, not because they were sick, but because they were undesirable. And I want to be clear, this isn't sensationalism. This isn't some urban legend twisted over time. These were real children, and they were systematically allowed to die. See, not every baby born at the ideal maternity home was considered adoptable. If the child had a visible disability or a birthmark, if they were sickly mixed race or simply didn't match what prospective parents were looking for, the Youngs had a word for them. They called them unmarketable. And to a normal human being, that word should sound dehumanizing. It should make your skin crawl. But to William and Lila Young, it was just part of the process, part of the business. These unwanted babies weren't treated with extra care or compassion. They weren't placed in long-term care or connected with social services. No, they were left to die slowly. The method was simple, cruel, almost unthinkable. They were fed a mixture of molasses and water. That was it. Just enough to keep them from crying constantly, but not enough to sustain them. No formula, no proper milk, no medication, no real human contact, just molasses and time. Most of them died within 2 weeks. That was the goal. Some of the staff at the home, the few who later spoke out, said it was like watching the life drain out of a baby one day at a time. A slow, quiet form of murder hidden behind the walls of a place that called itself ideal. And when the babies finally passed, their bodies were placed in wooden boxes, boxes originally used to deliver dairy products from a local creamery. On the outside, the labels read Butterbox. That's where the name comes from. Butterbox babies. It's strange how something so innocent sounding can carry so much horror. But those boxes weren't holding butter. They were coffins. The bodies were buried in secret, often in fields owned by Lila's family. According to one former employee, a man named Glenn, he personally helped bury over 100 infants. He said they stacked the boxes in rows like produce, like storage. Other times when burial wasn't possible, when the ground was frozen or the family couldn't pay for a funeral, the babies were burned in the home's incinerator. And when that wasn't an option, local fishermen were allegedly given the bodies and asked to dump them into the sea. I wish I were making that up, but that's what survivors say. That's what the few records we do have suggest. And the truth is, we'll probably never know the exact number of babies who died there. How many were buried? How many were burned? How many were thrown away like they never mattered? Because that's what this was about in the end value. To the Youngs, a child only had worth if someone was willing to pay for it. If not, that life simply didn't count. It didn't make the ledger. It didn't leave paperwork. It didn't get a name. It's hard to wrap your head around the scale of it. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't one or two tragic mistakes. It was a system. A cold, efficient operation designed to profit from the pain of women and to erase the children they couldn't sell. And even now, all these years later, I keep thinking about those tiny boxes, sitting in a shed, buried in rows, or worse, floating in the Atlantic. These were human lives. They were sons and daughters. They had heartbeats. They had mothers who carried them, feared for them, and in many cases, never even got to say goodbye. And what's even worse, most of those mothers had no idea what really happened to their babies, because the Youngs told them lies. And in the next chapter, we'll talk about how far those lies went, and what happened when one mother started asking questions no one wanted to answer. Chapter 7. A Mother's Instinct. There's something about a mother's intuition. It's not magic. It's not logic. It's deeper than that. It's something primal, a knowing that comes from carrying life inside your body. You just know when something's not right. And that's what this next part of the story is about, a mother who knew. She had given birth at the Ideal Maternity Home, just like so many others. Her labor had been long and difficult, but the baby, a little girl, was born alive, breathing, crying. She held her, nursed her. She remembers the warmth of that tiny body in her arms. But then, something changed. A few days later, Lila came into the room with a tight smile and told her the baby had become sick. It was sudden, Lila said. Unexpected. She insisted the mother couldn't see her daughter because the child needed rest privacy protection from outside germs. And then, an hour later, Lila came back. This time her face was cold, her voice flat. She told the mother that the baby had died. Just like that. No explanation, no doctor's report, no one to answer her questions. Just a death. Quiet. Dismissed. But the mother didn't believe her. She couldn't. She had just held that child, had seen her looking around the room with curious, blinking eyes. There was no sign of illness, no indication of struggle. Her baby had been fine, she knew it, and she wasn't the only one whispering. That same day, the mother overheard something in the hallway. A nurse, or maybe another girl staying at the home, mentioned that a wealthy couple was coming in from the city. They wanted to adopt a baby, specifically a girl. And as it happened, the baby who had died was the only girl in the nursery at the time. The timing was too perfect, too neat. When the mother started asking questions, Lila became defensive, cold, dismissive. She told her not to stir up gossip, that the baby was gone and nothing could change that. She even warned her that continuing to push would complicate her recovery. It was gaslighting, plain and simple, but it worked. What choice did she have? There were no records, no paperwork, no photographs, no proof her child had ever existed, and certainly none to prove she'd been taken. In the Ideal Maternity Home, everything was designed to be quiet, untraceable, disposable. So the mother left, alone, grieving, but also carrying a seed of doubt that would never go away. For the rest of her life, she searched. She wrote letters, tracked adoption agencies, looked for names that sounded familiar, dates that aligned, faces that resembled her own. But she never found her daughter. She died with that wound still open, never knowing for sure, but never really not knowing either. And that story, it's not unique. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of women who left that home with similar stories. Babies, they were told, had died suddenly without explanation. Burials they never saw. Death certificates that never arrived. And in so many of those cases, the truth is that the babies didn't die at all. They were sold, repackaged, renamed, sent to homes across Canada, the US, maybe even further handed off to families who had no idea the child they were adopting had been taken under a lie. It's one thing to lose a child. It's another to know in your gut that your child is still out there alive with no memory of you, and no idea they were stolen. That kind of grief, it never leaves. And the Youngs, they never stopped. Not then. Because as demand for babies grew, so did their profits. And their lies became more polished, more practiced. They weren't just preying on poor, vulnerable women anymore. They were marketing to the wealthy. And in the next chapter, we'll talk about how adoption itself became their most lucrative industry, and how even the people with money, power, and influence were being quietly deceived by the same well-oiled machine. Chapter 8. Babies for Sale. By this point in the story, I wasn't just disturbed. I was angry. Because the more I read, the more I realized that the Ideal Maternity Home didn't just exploit poor women. It didn't just take advantage of shame or secrecy or desperation. It found a way to package all of that and sell it to the highest bidder. Literally. Adoption became their goldmine, and it wasn't subtle. Families, usually wealthy, often from the United States, would travel to Nova Scotia looking for children. Some couldn't have kids of their own. Others wanted to avoid long adoption waitlists back home. The Youngs made the process easy, fast, and discreet. No background checks, no home visits, no red tape. Just cash. In fact, many families chose their babies before they were even born. They'd visit the home, look at the pregnant women staying there, and pick one based on her appearance, her health, her race. It was like shopping. It was eugenics in real time. And the Youngs, they leaned into it. They advertised in newspapers, used phrases like healthy babies, excellent lineage. They even promised that some of the children were of specific religions, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, depending on what the buyer wanted. Of course, that wasn't always true. Sometimes they flat out lied about a baby's background to close a deal. The family thought they were adopting a child who shared their beliefs or heritage, but that wasn't always the case. The Youngs didn't care about accuracy. They cared about money. A single baby could sell for as much as $10,000, and this was in the 1940s. That's over $150,000 today. And that number kept rising because demand kept growing. Politicians, business owners, even entertainers started showing up. Quietly, with envelopes of cash, and for every baby placed, the Youngs pocketed the profit. None of it went to the mothers. Very little went back into the home. Most of it vanished into their personal accounts, their wardrobes, their lifestyle. They lived modestly in public, but their bank statements told a different story. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, there was more. Because while the Youngs were profiting off babies, the women who gave birth to them were often left completely in the dark. Many of them were told their children had died. Others were forced to sign away parental rights under pressure. And some were simply given no information at all. Once the baby was gone, that was it. No follow-up, no closure, just silence. It was a perfect system for the Youngs, the shame of the mother, the desperation of the buyer, and the complete lack of oversight from the government. And it worked for years. They made millions. They gained respect in the community. They were held up as moral leaders, as humanitarians. Even local officials praised them. Their brochures featured smiling babies, kind quotes, even endorsements from political figures. But none of that could erase the truth. These weren't just adoptions. They were transactions carefully crafted, emotionally manipulated, and fueled by secrecy. And while some children may have gone on to live good lives, we'll never know how many were raised in homes that were unsafe, unloving, or built on lies. Because the Youngs didn't screen adoptive families, they didn't follow up. If you had the money, the baby was yours. No questions asked. And the worst part, people believed in them. Because the truth wasn't visible from the outside. The Ideal Maternity Home looked like it was doing good, helping women, placing babies, building families. And for a long time, no one wanted to look closer. But all it took was one person, one visitor, one moment of honesty to pull back the curtain. And in the next chapter, we'll talk about the woman who saw the cracks and decided not to stay silent. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Spoke Up. It's strange how long something this horrifying can stay hidden in plain sight. For years, the Ideal Maternity Home had operated without real oversight. Babies were being sold, mothers were being lied to, children were disappearing. And yet the community kept applauding. Donors kept giving. The government kept looking away. But all it takes is one person to pay attention. One person who doesn't walk away. In 1945, a woman arrived at the home, hoping to adopt a child. She wasn't poor. She wasn't desperate. She was educated from New York and had probably heard about the Ideal Maternity Home through word of mouth. She was told it was efficient, trustworthy a place where adoptions were handled quickly, privately, with no drama. But when she stepped through the doors, she saw something no brochure had prepared her for. She later described the smell hitting her almost immediately, the sharp stench of urine, unwashed bodies, neglect. The nursery was overcrowded. 3 babies to a crib. Some were pale, others visibly malnourished. None of them looked healthy, and the staff cold, distant, almost robotic. This wasn't a place of healing. It felt like a warehouse, a factory. No warmth, no tenderness. Just a transaction waiting to happen. And instead of keeping quiet like everyone else, she reported what she saw. She wrote to an adoption worker in New York and described everything in detail, the filth, the disorganization, the way the babies looked like no one had touched them in days. That letter sparked something. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to reach the ears of someone who could do something, Nova Scotia's Minister of Public Welfare, Dr. Frank Davis. Now Dr. Davis had already heard rumors about the Ideal Maternity Home. Whispers. Stories that didn't quite add up, but up until then nothing had been concrete. No one had really challenged the Youngs publicly, not in a way that would stick. This letter changed that. He sent an inspector. And what the inspector found confirmed everything and more. The conditions were appalling. Babies weighed half of what they should have for their age. The walls were dirty. The home lacked proper sanitation. And even though the Youngs insisted they were providing medical care, there were no doctors, no nurses, no standards, just a chiropractor and a midwife playing God. It was the first time someone with authority saw past the image. And it was the beginning of the end. Because once the reports started coming in, the government had to respond. They revised the laws, adding stricter requirements for maternity homes, including proper licensing medical staff and record keeping. The Ideal Maternity Home, of course, couldn't meet those standards. They were denied a license. Their operation was technically shut down. But of course, the Youngs didn't go quietly. Lila claimed she was being harassed, that the government was targeting them unfairly. She even tried to rally supporters, people who still believed in the image they'd crafted so carefully over the years. People who had no idea what was really going on behind the curtains. And for a little while they kept going, illegally, quietly, without a license. But the walls were closing in. And soon their name, once respected in the community, would become something else entirely. A symbol of betrayal, of cruelty, of children lost and women silenced. And what's almost poetic is that it all began to unravel, not because someone stormed in with headlines and sirens, but because one woman saw the truth and refused to stay silent. She could have walked away. She could have said, "It's not my problem." But she didn't. And that's something I keep coming back to in stories like these. So many people knew. So many people suspected. But very few actually said something. It only takes one voice to start an echo. And in the next chapter, we'll talk about what finally brought the Youngs to court, and how a legal case that was supposed to silence the critics ended up exposing everything they had worked so hard to hide. Chapter 10. A trial meant to silence. Sometimes the downfall of the most dangerous people doesn't come from a heroic investigator or a dramatic arrest. Sometimes they expose themselves. That's exactly what happened with William and Lila Young. After the government began cracking down on unlicensed maternity homes, the Ideal Maternity Home lost its legal standing. They weren't supposed to operate anymore. But they kept going quietly, defiantly. Lila especially refused to let go of the empire they had built. She didn't just deny the accusations. She acted like the victim. In her mind, they were being persecuted, harassed. She insisted they were only trying to help women. She painted herself as a martyr, someone being unfairly targeted by gossip bureaucracy and jealous outsiders who didn't understand what they were doing. And then, she made a mistake. She filed a lawsuit. Lila sued a local newspaper for $25,000, claiming defamation over articles that had exposed the horrific practices inside the home. She wanted to shut them up, shut everyone up. But what she didn't realize was that court cases work both ways. And this one, it opened the door wide. Because once that lawsuit was filed, everything came under review. Witnesses were called. Documents were subpoenaed. Former residents came forward. Journalists dug deeper. And suddenly all the secrets the Youngs had buried for years were being spoken in public, under oath. The courtroom wasn't filled with just words. It was filled with truths. Testimonies about mothers being coerced, about babies being taken without consent, about payments being demanded for burials that never happened, about children disappearing, and about how the Youngs kept almost no records, making it nearly impossible for anyone to trace what had really happened to their child. Lila had started this lawsuit thinking she could clear her name, but it became her undoing. Because now the entire community was watching, now the authorities were listening. Now there were official findings, not just rumors. In the end, both Lila and William were convicted. Not for murder, not for manslaughter, not even for fraud, though honestly they should have been. They were convicted of violating the Maternity Boarding House Act and practicing medicine without a license. And the punishment? A fine. Just $150. It's almost laughable. After everything they did, the deaths, the lies, the lives they shattered, the legal system handed them what amounted to a parking ticket. But something had changed. They weren't untouchable anymore. Their name no longer carried weight. The respect they had once commanded gone. The trial had peeled away their mask. Their home was shut down for good. Donations stopped. Their supporters vanished. They tried to keep fighting, but they were broke, isolated, and publicly shamed. And for the first time, people started asking harder questions. How many babies really died? Where did all the money go? How many children were adopted under false pretenses? There were no answers, no full accounting, no proper justice. But the silence had been broken. The young spent the rest of their lives in relative obscurity. William died in 1962 from cancer. Lila followed 5 years later in 1967 from leukemia. She was buried near the same field where dozens, maybe hundreds of babies had been quietly laid to rest in butterboxes. It's hard to wrap your head around that someone responsible for so much pain could end their life in peace, in privacy, with a gravestone bearing their name. Meanwhile, the children they discarded and the mothers they traumatized were left with nothing. No closure, no records, no graves, just unanswered questions. But still, that trial mattered, because it cracked the foundation. It told survivors they weren't crazy. It confirmed what so many women had whispered in fear for decades, that they were exploited, that their babies were stolen, that this wasn't just some tragic misunderstanding. It was a system, and it was finally collapsing. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what happened to the home itself, the building, the land, and the physical traces of a place that promised safety and delivered silence. Chapter 11: Ashes and Silence. After stories like this, I always find myself wondering about the place, the physical place, because buildings hold energy. They hold memories even if the walls are torn down and the paint is long faded. The floors still remember the footsteps. The doorways still hold shadows. You can feel it even if you don't believe in that kind of thing, you can feel it. The Ideal Maternity Home was no exception. After it was officially shut down, the building sat for a while, quiet, empty, forgotten by some, whispered about by others. No one wanted to talk about what had happened there, not really, but no one wanted to walk past it either. And then, in 1962, it burned down. The cause, suspicious. Most believe it was arson. No one was ever charged, but the timing, the circumstances, it all felt too deliberate to be an accident. Some say it was an act of justice. Others call it an attempt to erase what couldn't be forgiven. The land where the Ideal Maternity Home once stood was never turned into a memorial. There's no museum, no official marker, nothing to let you know the scale of what happened there. It's just grass now, trees, soil, ordinary, unremarkable ground. And that's what makes it feel even more haunting. Because that field, that unassuming patch of earth, is where the babies were buried. The Butterbox babies. Some were placed gently in rows in small wooden boxes meant to carry dairy. Others, according to witnesses, were left in sheds or handed to local fishermen or cremated without ceremony. And now they're just gone. No headstones, no names, no birth certificates, just silence, just dirt. It feels cruel, doesn't it? To know that so many lives ended before they even began, and that the place where it happened is now just a place. A story most people don't know, a field you could drive by without ever realizing the grief rooted in the ground beneath it. I've read that to this day, some believe the remains of those babies still rest there, that not all of them were moved, that not all of them were ever found. Some survivors have tried to locate siblings, half-siblings, mothers. Many haven't succeeded, because the records were destroyed. The paper trail never really existed. It was designed that way. There is, however, a small website run by volunteers that tries to help connect people who were adopted through the Ideal Maternity Home with their birth families. It's something. It's not justice, it's not reparation, but it's something. A sliver of light in a long shadow. Because even now, all these decades later, the pain still lingers. Not just in history books or documentaries, but in the real lives of people walking among us today, people who don't know their real names, who don't know where they were born, who don't know if their mother ever had a chance to hold them. Some of them are still looking, and maybe that's what this chapter of the story is really about. Not the home, not the ashes, but what was left behind and who is still searching for it. Because when a system like this falls, it doesn't end cleanly. It leaves echoes. And in the final chapter, we'll talk about those echoes, about legacy, about accountability, and about the quiet, powerful resistance of remembering. Chapter 12: The Echoes. Some stories don't end when the building burns down. They don't fade when the criminals die. They don't get tied up neatly with a trial or a headline or a plaque. they echo. The story of the Ideal Maternity Home and the Butterbox babies is one of those stories. It echoes in every woman who was silenced, every mother who left that place empty-handed, wondering for the rest of her life if her child was dead or stolen. It echoes in the adults today now in their 60s, 70s, maybe older, who grew up never knowing where they came from, who were adopted through a transaction, not a system, who carry questions that have no paperwork, no records, no traceable beginning. And it echoes in us. In the people who hear it now and feel that awful weight settle in our chest, the disbelief, the anger, the heartbreak. How could this happen? How could so many people know or suspect and do nothing? That's the question that stuck with me the most. Because this wasn't some hidden basement in the middle of nowhere. This was a registered operating home with advertisements in newspapers, public donations, community praise. People walked in and out every day. Neighbors lived nearby. Babies were born and then gone. Mothers screamed into their pillows. Money exchanged hands. And it all kept going. It kept going because shame kept people quiet, because trust in appearances blinded judgment, because the word charity made people feel good even when it was built on cruelty. It kept going because silence is easier than confrontation. But silence is dangerous. It gives people like the Youngs power. It turns a house into a machine, a lie into a system. It makes the unthinkable possible. That's why we tell stories like this. Not for shock value, not to dig up old pain, but because these echoes matter, because there are still survivors trying to piece together the truth, still families searching for names, for connections, for answers they may never find. And because it's not just about them, it's about what we allow, what we look away from, what we choose to believe when something seems too horrible to be true. The Ideal Maternity Home should have been a safe place. It should have been what it claimed to be, a refuge for scared young women and a beginning for vulnerable children. Instead, it became a machine that commodified life and buried shame, sometimes literally. And yet, somehow, stories survived. Whispers turned into testimony. One woman spoke up. Then another. Then another. And now here we are telling the story again, making sure it doesn't disappear. Because remembrance is resistance. Saying the names even when we don't know all of them. Holding space for grief even when it's quiet. Asking questions even when the answers don't come. These are small acts, but they matter. So if you're still with me at the end of this story, thank you for listening, for carrying this history, for letting it echo. And if you or someone you know was touched by the Ideal Maternity Home, if you're searching or grieving or remembering, I see you. You are not alone. You never were. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I know it wasn't easy to hear. Some stories aren't. But they need to be told because for too long the people who suffered through them were never given the space to speak. Many still aren't. If this story resonated with you, or if you're someone who's personally connected to this case, whether through adoption, family history, or memory, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, stories that reveal, remember, and reflect, please consider subscribing to True Crime Echoes. We don't do shock, we do truth. Until next time, take care of yourself. Be gentle with others, and never stop asking questions even when the world tells you not to. I'll see you in the next one.